In 1998, he set up Fundraising Training Limited to help organisations develop their fundraising strategies. And I think Bill is probably best known for his expertise in the field of grant seeking from charitable trusts and government organisations. I, for one, was very lucky to attend his Skilled Grant Seekers course about 18 months ago now. He offers lots of different training, so do have a look on his website after this if you're interested in any of that training. And David, thank you ever so much for joining us. We have an extra co-host today that we weren't expecting. David has more than 25 years experience of senior management positions in charities. He has been chief executive of 3 foundations and has sat on the board of many more foundations and charitable organisations. And he was a member of the UK Social Investment Task Force between 2000 and 2010. So without further ado, over to you. Thank you.
Sophie, thank you so much for that introduction. That's okay. My name is Bill Bruty, and as Sophie says correctly, this is what you look like after 40 years of fundraising. Yeah, I did a set up Fundraising Train Limited, and we managed to break it down grant seeking into 27 different modules. So there's a 61 workshop program available on our website, which looks at every aspect of grant seeking, as well as training people in grant seeking and helping people with their grant seeking strategies. We also work with a number of funders helping their partners towards sustainability. And ironically, 2 of them are not in the UK. The main 2 we work with are international. So there's a Siegel Family Foundation who are based in New Jersey that we work very closely with, and then Porticus, which is very much an international funder based in the Netherlands. So we kind of see it from both sides. What we're going to do today is we're going to, we did a review back at the end of 2022, looking at saying what actually happened from our perspective with grant making during the pandemic. And we're going to cover a little bit of that ground today, and that's what's in the report that Sophie sent round to you. Now what we're doing is nearly coming out for a year later than that report, we're sitting down and thinking, now we've got the data from 22, what is actually happening post-pandemic? So we hope to share a little bit of that today. As I said, we're going to have about 15-20 minutes of presentation from David and I, and then we'll have some discussing, because I think for us, this is a way of also finding out from you what your experiences are, because this for us is part of a more robust journey of research to get a bit of an understanding from this. I'm going to do the numbers, so I'm going to look at the number side of it. David, I'll briefly hand over to you. We want to do a little bit more of an introduction to you, and then David's going to look at the grant-making behaviours.
Okay, thanks, and hello everybody. I've done a few things with Bill in recent years when he has been presenting the numbers, and to try and keep people awake because the numbers are quite tough. I then talk a bit about what appears to be the behaviour that's informing the practice of funders and foundations, both individual high net worth individuals as well as foundations. And that's what we're doing today. It's not just COVID. I mean, the bit that I'm intrigued by is how they've responded to the cost of living crisis and hideous inflation. And obviously, that's very difficult to get at the data because it's still too recent. So your experience day to day of what has been going on among foundations will be immensely helpful to us in trying to build a picture of what's going on. So yeah, I'll come back later on the behaviour after Bill has blasted you with numbers.
Okay, so sit back, folks, wait for some numbers, and we will be sending a more detailed report from this. So you will be getting some of this in, so you can take notes, but we will be sending out some very comprehensive notes. So let's start off. Hopefully you're seeing before you what is a fish tank. This is our number source. In many, well, I've got a, what I did was create a data set of 100 UK foundations. And it was deliberately created as a cross-section of the foundation world. It was meant to represent the type of portfolio that a lot of my clients had. So this fish tank has big fish in it, it has little fish in it, it has medium-sized fish in it, and it's kind of a good range of the type of portfolio that you will be working with. We've been capturing financial data from the fish tank since 2004. So it's a really interesting study group over a long period of time to begin to look at some of the behaviors. So what we often do is we look at the fish tank and see whether that is giving us an indication as to what's going on with the whole of the UK trust market. Now, one thing I'd say about the fish tank is that, as in many data sets, I say it's 100 foundations, 9 data entries, and a diagonal slice. It's about 570 million in grants at its peak and 14 billion in assets. One of the things about a fish tank, though, and this is exactly the same with your portfolios of trust, is behavior. The total figures are going to be skewed by the behaviors of a small number of foundations. So within this data set, there are skews. When in the timetable we've had David and Claudia Harding coming in from virtually nowhere, giving out 125 million £125 million in gifts, and then going back to being so small that they don't even register a set of accounts. So that coming in does tend to have an impact on your data, but that's kind of the reality. Now, we crunch through this data set as well as David's interviews and knowledge, and this is what this is broadly speaking what we concluded at the end of 22 about what we saw going on during the pandemic. So we're going to go back to this. What we found within our data set.
I'm not getting any video. Sorry, I'm not getting any sound. I'm getting video, but no sound.
Is that the same for everybody else?
I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
No, I can hear you clearly, Bill. I'm sorry, Colin. I'm not sure why you can't hear. Can you hear me? Okay, no, Bill, you're okay. Okay, I'll plow on. Right. What we found was that undoubtedly during the pandemic, especially in 21, there had been a significant increase in grant making. However, when we drilled into it, a lot of that, the reasons for those increases were already in the system before the pandemic. So some of them were for the pandemic, a lot of it was actually to a degree coincidental. The principal thing was the money that enabled people to get to give increased philanthropy was already in the system. One of the reasons for this is over the last few years, we've seen much greater use of investment gains by foundations to fund grants as well as investment income. So investment gains is where you've made money through trading shares or buying and selling properties. You've turned it into cash and you're using it for grants. So that extra flow of money coming into foundations has certainly given an increased capacity for them to give. What's definitely happening is investment gains are very volatile, and what tends to happen is foundations smooth the peaks and troughs out, so they don't react going on a spending spree if they've had a large amount of gains, and equally they don't contract their giving when they lose money or the gains are less. They tend to smooth it out. The one I've already referred to, the big fish in the tank really determine the big changes in any market. This is more on the side that David was looking at, and this is about funder behaviors during the pandemic. Far more collaborations. So funders consciously talking together, agreeing strategies, co-funding. Much more engaged relationships between funders and their partners. More unrestricted funding, more flexibility and less administration for grantees. Climate change and diversity are moving into being core issues with many more foundations than they were a few years ago. And increasing willingness to use money now if it's available, because there was a crisis then, and it's I think a lot of people took the view, well, rather than we can't sit by and play the game tight when the money is needed now. And then sensitive considerations of the implications of inflation. So a lot of evidence of
funders showing a concern about it and considering it in their grant making strategies. And then the ethical sources of funding of grants will become more of an issue. And we've seen that dramatically with Lankelly Chase and their decision to wind up very much based upon the ethics of investing. So these were our conclusions back in 2022. And we're intrigued as to whether these behaviors and these finances that we saw, have they become embedded? So this is our big question. Were we correct in our financial predictions, and have these behavior changes become embedded? So what we're going to do now is do a quick run through what we see now. I'm going to do the numbers, so I'm going to reveal to you what the fish tank analysis has revealed so far, and then I'll hand over to David, who will share more about the funder behaviors. Right, now I haven't been able to get through the entirety of my 100 in my fish tank. Some literally just time, I haven't had the chance to go through them, and others because we haven't had the accounts submitted for 2022 yet. So this is not the whole of the fish tank. This is 80% of the fish tank that I'm comparing. So I'm doing like for like comparisons with the 80%. And let's have a look at their income. There is clearly far less money coming into trusts in 22 than there have been in recent years. Here are the figures. So what we can see in, we go down to the very bottom row and we'll look at 2022 on the left. And this group, this like-for-like comparison, have had 202 million in terms of income compared with 306 in 21, and 247 in 20 and 281 in 2019. Now, 21 was a very generous year and a good year for income, but you can see even 22 is way below what we were in 2019. Now, I have to put a caveat on this because my fish tank is also a bit like a lucky dip. And I could put my hand into the remaining 20% and find one or two what I call distorters that change this whole picture. So this isn't the final picture. We may find by the time we've done the whole data set, there's one or two foundations in the lower end of the list who come in with some significant income changes. But on like for like within their space, this is clearly saying there's less money. Right, let's have a look at another comparison. This is investment gains. Having talked about how foundations are increasingly using the casino, the buying and selling of shares, the buying and selling of property and the gains from that to fund grants, what's going on with investment gains? Again, far less money. So in 2022, and this is quite dramatic, investment gains for this group were 216 million compared with 605 million in 21. So if you're using this as a source of funding grants, there's less money around. You can see in 2020 that it really plummeted, so that the total group only gained 64 million investment gains. The overall picture is most foundations lost a lot of money in 2020. There's one or two in the study who didn't lose money but had dramatically less gains than what they normally do. So the first thing is here, the fuel of cash coming into our foundations in our study is reduced quite significantly by their income, the dividends and the rental income and donations, and the profits from asset trading are considerably down over what we've had over the last few years. So this is a big one. How does this translate in terms of grant making? And there is a time lag between your income trends and your grant budgets. So they're not always in the same year. The income that you had in the previous few years may determine your future budget. So but this is interesting. Again, like for like, they're giving out 243 million in 22. This compares with 305 in 21 and a very low figure of 224 when the panic set in. in 2020 during the pandemic, but it's still way short of the figure we had in 2019. So that's the number picture, top line number picture. I do want to go back to a little bit on the big fish in the tank, because they do distort the figures, and I've really got to keep an eye on the big fish. Now, the big fish, in my definition, is any foundation in our study who has a track record of giving over 10 million in grants. So of the data that I've looked at, there were 7 big fish, people giving over 10 million, who could have had a dramatic change that could distort my figures. So let's have a look at what's happened with the data, what I call the data distorters. 3 have decreased their giving from 2020 to 21 and are back at the 2019 levels. 1 is beneath 2019 and 2021-22. So they are down. 1 has maintained their giving right the way across the year, the 4 years in question. So 4 down, 1 at a steady level, and 2 have gone up. And interestingly, those have gone up across all years. So there's been a steady rise with these 2. It's not been the roller coaster that we've seen with other people. So money-wise, income coming in and grants going out, for like comparison, the fish tank is telling me clearly there's less money around, there's reduced grant making. And then when I'm looking at the behavior of the distorters, who can change this picture quite dramatically, more are on the decreasing side of the line than the increase side of that, although obviously that's a tiny data set we're looking at. So that's my early doors on the numbers. So David, if I hand over to you, and I'll stop the share and I'll let you give the other perspective.
Okay, thanks, Bill, very much. Yes, my obsession, one might say, is not so much just what the numbers tell us, but whether or not there are detectable changes in the practice of funders and foundations in particular, which fundraisers either need to be alert to, or to push for more of, or to challenge. Now, I suppose, spent too many years of my life ranting away and grumbling about the practice of foundations, because they've been so resistant in general to change or disruption. Their behavior has often been very oppressive towards the organizations they fund. They've over-insisted on restricted grants, and they've resisted funding operational costs. So I've been quite vicious sometimes in my criticism of those foundations. But then COVID came along, and at the same time as COVID burst on the scene, we also had foundations trying to address the issues raised by, for example, Black Lives Matter, by the accelerating climate emergency, by civil society losing the term civil and becoming uncivil in many areas. And of course, in more recent years, the history of colonialism and how that affected the creation of their original endowment. So in the space of a relatively small number of years, foundations have grappled with some quite major challenging issues about either the context within which they're operating now, or the context within which their wealth has been built up. And I think it's produced a more uncomfortable time for foundations than has been the case in the past. Having said all of that, one has to acknowledge all the time, and as Bill has emphasized, these foundations, both the ones in his sample and the many hundreds beyond the sample, vary enormously in size, in history, in focus, in organization, in governance, and in what they do and how they do it. So it's very hard to generalize, but there are certain themes that seem to have emerged in recent years. Some of those were very clearly pointed out by a study the Association of Charitable Foundations did back in 2020, so the first year of COVID. They explored with their members, ACF did, as to how much change there had been as a direct response to COVID. And some of you may be familiar with that, and indeed we've touched on it a bit in the past in this session already, that there were some new grant programs announced. There were increased funding for existing organisations to help them see their way through the COVID period. There was closer collaboration with funders. They found that 96% of ACF members had changed the way they work in response to COVID, which was pretty amazing figure. And what's more than 80% intended, having learnt new ways of doing things, to retain that increased flexibility going forward. So that was in 2020. Then I think has come another major challenge to the life and thinking of foundations, which has been the hideous rate of inflation of the past 18 months, 2 years. And organisations that foundations fund, therefore, and the communities they support, facing and trying to grapple with catastrophic cost of living increases, both in the way their communities, whichever focus they have, are operating, but also in their own operations and the operations of the charities they're supporting. And again, ACF did a study last year trying to see whether or not there had been changing practice as a result of that. It wasn't as clear-cut as the COVID stuff, but there were some clear indications that many foundations had deliberately set out to spend more with organisations they already supported to help them through this period of rising costs and rising need. There seemed to be a lot more dialogue between funders and their grantees about how inflation was affecting them, and particularly how increased energy prices were impacting, so they could understand better the foundations, whether there were areas of the budgeting of the organisations and the communities within which they work, which needed to be adjusted short term. There were some foundations being very proactive in supporting organisations that they had supported for a long time to be good employers, to not inadvertently push down wages or conditions by their own funds, so that the funders themselves were not the cause of salaries being frozen or pushed down. There seemed to be also some indications that they learned from COVID very much, that if you don't fund with equity in mind, then you run the risk of being inequitable in what you do by default. And clearly, when you get energy costs inflating in the way they have over the past 18 months, 2 years, you have to look very hard at how organizations are coping with that. And there were also signs, and this ties in with talk, which you've probably seen in the journals and in the press, about the emergence of more trust-based funding. So perhaps a confusing use of the word trust, but this is actually talking about trust as opposed to trust as trusts. But more signs of organizations being prepared to help organizations through their core funding rather than constantly demanding project and restricted funding. So those trends have been emerging, or were emerging, during the early period of this very heightened inflation. And what we're trying to get a hang on, and it's quite hard to hear unless obviously we're talking to you, the people who are actually dealing with foundations, as to whether these trends have been visible among more than a minority of foundations. And if they have, are they continuing, or are things now backtracking as foundations revert to where they're most comfortable, which has been the practice of the past 20 or 30 years. So I think for us, the most interesting thing will be your feedback on what your current experience is of dealing with foundations, both big and small, as they grapple with the sort of problems which the charities you're working with are also grappling with in such an intense way. So that's my thoughts, and obviously I'm really happy to hear the sort of things that you're experiencing.
Right, that's our bit out. Sophie, have there been any questions put in the chat that we would, for clarification or anything we can do? Because now we'd like to open up the floor to your experiences, your questions, and then we can throw in more as we go.
Perfect. I don't think there's been any clarification questions. Just we've been asked if it's possible to have a copy of the slides as well, Bill. Maybe just the update on the kind of where we're at now, and obviously everybody has the full report as well to read at a later date.
There was also I think a question about whether increased interest rates would have affected increased income. The reality is for foundations it would be marginal because very little money will have been kept in cash.
Thanks, David. Okay, has anybody got any questions for Bill or David?
So we've got James, Sophia.
Good morning, gentlemen, and Sophie. Good afternoon. Morning. Thanks very much for all of that. One of the questions, Bill, you were going through was looking at the scaling up, down, or remaining the same in terms of the funding provided. I wonder whether you've got any information relating to the themes of support that either are being increased in support, reduced in support, or staying the same. So is it around mental health, children, education, employability, poverty alleviation? Are there particular themes that are showing themselves to be increasingly supported or being drawn away from? And a second part of that question is my reflection on general response from trusts and foundations. Is everybody, in quotes, is being inundated as a result of public sector costs being reduced? So any support from statutory funding being cut significantly is adding massive pressure to the trusts and foundations, and now then looking at corporates and philanthropists. So I think that the biggest response that we've got from our engagement with trusts and foundations is that it is becoming so much more competitive simply because the public pot is getting much smaller. So that's kind of a response, but I'd be interested to know whether the themes that you're seeing increasingly supported, reducingly supported, or remaining the same, whether you've got any views on that, please.
I mean, from our fish tank, we haven't done that analysis, so I can't draw conclusions from the fish tank. It is something which we'll probably do over time. I mean, there are other studies, and what I see in the other studies is often that in times when foundations are giving more or changing their giving patterns, repurposing, shifting purpose of grants is very, very very marginal, very at the fringes. And I think we can see this with what happened in the pandemic, is foundations gave more, but they gave more to the same areas that they traditionally gave to. David might be able to give a bit more in terms of shifts he's seeing in terms of purpose. I will come back on the competition question, because I think this is a really relevant one, because I think this is an area that's coming under increasing competition because of the destinies with other funding, governments and community fundraising and individual giving. And also, I mean, for us, one of the things that we do, we track jobs in trust fundraising that would be relevant for people that might attend our courses. And so just before this, I did a little register of our jobs tracking list. And if I go back to 2020, there were only 7 jobs being advertised in trust fundraising that we saw would be of the type of someone to go on our courses. It was a real collapse in the employment market at that point. Obviously, 2020 was a year of great indecision. It came back in 21, and we started tracking 36 jobs in 21. But this is the interesting stuff. In 22, our tracking figures go to 89 jobs. So a dramatic increase in the number of trust fundraising roles being advertised. And then in 2023, so far, it's up to 103 jobs. So I think as a way of measuring the competition, there is clearly a lot more people at it. But I'll hand over to you, David, in terms of any shifts you see in purposing.
It's, again, a huge caveat about avoiding generalization. But I mean, I think the thing which was, I thought, quite striking about the Foundation's response to COVID and now to inflation is that, if anything, those who've got long-term relationships with organizations, whether those organizations be local or national or indeed international, they seem to have been willing to look at translating that long-term loyalty even into even longer-term support. So the organizations that were getting 2-3 year grants are being offered, let alone having to ask for, longer term support to get them through these difficult periods. We've seen a number of examples of that. Okay, it isn't every foundation, and it'll be those foundations which already have a commitment to long-term support which are doing that. But that was quite striking, I thought, about some of the feedback that we were getting. On the thematic one, I think it's very hard to be clear on that because interests are so diverse and so varied. But if you don't already, I should keep an eye on the material on the Association of Charitable Foundations website about their Stronger Foundations work and also their Funders Collaborative Hub, because that's a good indicator of where some of the more energetic foundations, perhaps some of the medium to large ones, are getting more and more interested. Clearly, climate emergency has been a dominating factor of a lot of the discussions among foundations in recent years. That is reflected not so much just in them saying we're going to fund lots and lots of stuff in climate, but them asking questions of organizations they're funding, which are relevant to the climate emergency, about the practice of those organizations themselves. The other thing I think, which I just add to that, is your point about public sector cuts. Obviously, some of those are intensely local, and some of those are more difficult to be precise about because they're overall national funding. Where a foundation has got a strong place-based or local community focus, then I think you'll find, I hope you'll find, that they have been more responsive to the impact of local cuts on the local communities they've got a commitment to, because it's inevitable that if those communities, the communities that have been the focus of their work for many years, to see the infrastructure and to see the community health being taken apart by cuts is going to engender change in the way they practice. But it would be foolish to pretend that they can, even if all their money was put together, they can make a serious dent in the overall program of cuts. I think it was Roundtree some years ago who pointed out that if all the foundations in the whole of the UK clubbed together to support the NHS, it would keep the NHS going for about 22 minutes. So, I mean, we're talking about a scale of funding which is outside the reach of the foundation sector, even though there are some very, very big players in it. So, but it does, I think, mean that if you've got relationships with foundations, engage with them. They want to know more about the impact on the areas they're funding and the areas they're most strongly feel they want to support. And the more you're able to illuminate for them the impact of change that's going on in those communities, the more perhaps they will be able to be influenced in the way they direct their funding.
Sophie, I'll let you be in charge of who we respond to, because there's quite a few hands up, and I've got a kind of fairly minimal view of.
You're looking at too many things, Bill. Thanks ever so much, both of you. I think Mark was next with the question, please.
So, two things. One is a statement and one is a question. So, apologies. Going back to what you were talking about, seeing a trend towards more and more jobs being advertised in trusts and foundation fundraising. Over the last 5 years, in my conversations with SMTs, we've noticed that more and more trusts and foundations are being considered the low-hanging fruit, as more and more major donors and HNWIs are hiding behind, if you like, trusts and foundations, and putting in that as an extra barrier to being asked. 5-6 years ago, you'd go and see an HNWI or a major donor, and you'd have that conversation. Now they're saying, we have a trust or a foundation, so you have to apply through that. So for many, what used to be the longer haul has now become the short haul with trusts and foundations. And more SMTs are resting on the idea of bringing in more trust and foundation fundraisers. But of course, there's a dearth of talent out there, notwithstanding everybody, obviously, who's on this call. But I think that's why you're seeing that trend happening. And it's certainly why we're looking at bringing more trust and foundation fundraisers into our organization. The question that I was going to ask was, from your shark tank or your fish tank, how many of you may not have this, but how many of these trusts and foundations have you seen that 5 years ago were giving their money overseas, who are now giving almost entirely or in part far more into the UK?
Oh, interesting. Again, we've really concentrated on number crunching with the fish tank. So these shifts in purposing, we can kind of pick up from anecdotal or inadvertent, kind of accidental stuff from it. I think my wider perspective, doing quite a lot of work in international development funding in the UK, is it has undoubtedly become a harder area to raise money for. The universe has got smaller, which would indicate to me that it's probably been a bit of a flight to more domestic funding. I think this competition factor, which you rightly pointed out, is very significant, and I can understand why, because the barriers to entry with trust fundraising are very low. You can do it with a freelancer, you can do it with relatively risk-free investment and get a return. So I can totally understand why people would put into it. But as I say, I've got real concern with the evidence that I've got of a shrinking pot and an increasing number of people heading towards it. I think it's a potential sort of crisis around the corner for us, I fear. David, do you want to?
Well, only that, I mean, it's an either or. If you're a foundation which is committed to a particular area or a particular organization or a particular cause, you want to protect and strengthen that recipient. And so, yes, that may mean, and I noticed that one of the chats or comments already come through with it, that you're going to be less willing to look at new applicants, because your commitment is to the people you've been supporting over maybe decades. We certainly found, when I was on an organization's board until last year, that 5 of the funders there who'd been supporting them for 2 or 3 year grant basis on a repetitive basis were changing their rules in relation to the organizations they'd already supported. Now, I think that's good in some ways. We've been arguing for long-term support from foundations for many, many decades. But yes, it does mean that if they've got limited resources, that means that there's limited access to new applicants. It's a constant balancing act for foundations, and very few have found a way of communicating it clearly or understandably, because they're not necessarily sure how they're doing it themselves. I think the overseas UK is, I haven't heard of organisations which have got a good track record in funding overseas from the UK pulling back. There may have been a few, but I haven't heard about those. The reality is that foundations in the UK are not generous overseas funders. The general public are more generous in funding overseas than foundations are. So the number of foundations that actually are active outside the UK is very small, always has been, and I suspect always will be. But include among them some very big ones. And some of your HNWIs are examples of that. New people coming into the foundation sector with big personal money, creating their own foundations for obvious tax reasons. And they have often a very keen interest in global or overseas issues. And again, climate change will be an important theme within that.
Thank you, David. Next question from Inner Yoga.
Hi, yeah, my name's Kate. Sorry, it's a slightly misleading title. I was doing a yoga event this weekend, but I'm a trust fundraising consultant for a number of charities in Bristol. 2-part question. Firstly, the 7 big fish that you were talking about, I wonder if you could name the one that has maintained throughout and the 2 that have gone up. And second part to the question is, have you got any views or have you done any research on new trusts being set up?
Right, interesting. Yeah, the 7 that are the big fish that we've managed to track something for David and Claudia Harding, Bridge House Estates, Leverhulme, National Arts Collection Fund, Fidelity Foundation, Rothschild Foundation, and Henry Smith. And the 2 that have consistently grown over the period are Rothschilds, which were giving out 4.1 million in 2019 and are now giving out 13.9 million. So that's been quite a significant growth. And then Henry Smith, that was giving out 33 million in 2019 and in 2022 gave out 68 million. So those 2 have been quite consistent growth. Or as I say, all of the others have been either static or declined over that period.
Illustrates fantastically well, Bill, the sheer diversity among the foundation sector. I mean, there aren't 2 of those. No 2 of those have similar roots, background, ambitions, causes. I mean, their diversity is extraordinary. Your door is opening, Bill. You may find someone's.
Oh yeah, I've got my assistants joining me. Anyway, the one thing I will say, in a fish tank, and you have fish tanks, all of you with trust portfolios, 95% of the fish in the tank behave pretty much in the same way as they've always behaved. So they behave in terms of their purpose, and they behave in terms of here's my assistant, and they behave in terms of money. In virtually, there's a very little change. There will be 5 in your portfolio that will be the drivers of change, these data distorters, as I call them. What's interesting in our study, which goes back to 2004, is the 5 distorters in each year are always different. So it's kind of like you're sitting there with under 100 trees, and then one of them has got fruit to fall from it, or 5 of them have. And it's just, are you lucky enough to be sitting under one of the 5 that's changing its behaviour? So I think that is a real. We can talk about the herd, but then we've also got to talk about the particular. And I think, as David's pointing out there, but they are very, very particular. New trusts. We don't track new trusts in this study. You kind of see an indicator around it, which is injections of donations into our established group seem to indicate the flow of new money going into foundations. So we do see some link with years where there's been a lot of foundation income, donation income, and the creation of new trusts. So this is, you've got personal wealth, you've got an existing trust. Sorry, is this noise? Oh, I can hardly hear a thing. It's dog's school. So the creation of the, if you've got a trust and you come into money, you'll put it into the trust. If you've got to come into money and you want to create philanthropy, you will create a trust. And we're definitely seeing a kind of decline in the new money going into trusts. So it might be there's a decline in money in terms of creation.
Just
David.
Just a quickie on that. I'm not aware, but I'd be delighted to hear if there is any. I'm not aware of any recent evidence in the UK suggesting there's been any increase in the number of new trusts. If anything, there's been anecdotal evidence there's been a decrease, that there's been less new trusts emerging on the scene. But that is, I'm not aware of evidence, so there may be some clear evidence that you have also got. I noticed in the chat box there was someone commenting on the fact that to want more trust and trying to get at mental health and grassroots and refugee and asylum seeker issues. I'm sure that's right. The refugee asylum issue is one that's become much more dominating of conversations, and the despair among many foundations about present government practice is translating into support. But again, the demand is huge. So that's not going to make things easier for anybody because they're having to concentrate the money where they can. But the thing which I think has made differences is the opening up of online applications. It's probably made things harder for those fundraisers who operate on a very much more person-to-person and engaged way than they might have done. But it ought to be, because I ran foundations where we made a very high priority on trying to improve our online performance. It ought to ensure that the actual work being done by foundation staff is more focused on the issues than it is on the administration. And that should produce better informed foundation practice, in theory. Whether it is, I'd be delighted and interested to hear.
Thank you. What I'm doing, Bill and David, is I am making a copy of all of these comments that are coming in the meeting chat. If they're more comments rather than questions, if we don't have a chance to get onto everything, so that I can share with you after if you haven't had a chance to read everything. But over to Alex now, who I think has another question.
Hiya. I'm actually a person that has a comment rather than a question, so sorry.
No, we're open for those.
So yeah, I just wanted to second James's point as well in terms of statutory funding. As a charity, the charity that I work for, we're trying to be as responsible as possible. So we've been uplifting salaries, and on top of that, there are other costs on top, such as, say, energy costs and things like that, which have increased through inflation. But we found that the statutory funding that we would receive, they're not offering us uplifts. So it just means that there's a huge amount of pressure on the charity in terms of what our next steps are towards specific projects that are affected, and also added pressure towards the trusts and foundations who we're applying for as well.
Thanks, Alex. Has anybody else got a question they would like to ask in person to Bill or David? I'll just quickly check the messages again. There's a question in the chat from James. Do you believe that online applications are run through a review algorithm to refine the full list to a manageable number of applications to be personally reviewed? And what factors do you think affect these algorithms? For example, certain words being used, word count, etc. Very interesting question, James.
Can you answer? Do you have?
David, I'll let you go first.
Well, I was going to interest to know what James's answer to that was. Yeah, the other way of looking at it, and I'll just give you an illustration of the significance of the online approach. If you're a fairly generalist foundation, one with several causes, not just a single focus, then you receive an enormous number of applications which are never going to get beyond first read. I mean, they're just being put in on spec, and they are often ineligible. Now, one of the huge benefits of the arrival of the internet within, or the web-based stuff within applications, is being able to ensure you concentrate only on those which really are eligible. And a good foundation will ensure that that's what's happening. When we set up what became City Bridge Trust, when I set up Bridge House Estates, as it then was, we warned the Corporate of London that their first year was going to be absolute bedlam, because they were the biggest funder ever to arrive on the London scene. And you know full well that every single London organisation, or even indeed a lot of organisations that have nothing to do with London, were going to make applications. Unless you were going to bin the lot, if you were going to observe some courtesies to make sure they knew you'd received it and you dealt with it, you had to find a way of using, in our case, we did, web-based technology to deal with some of that, to try and ensure that we only focus the time of the assessors on those that were actually within the 5 priority areas of City Bridge Trust. And it is a constant dilemma. On one hand, yes, algorithms or versions of them can be terrifyingly awful, but they can also make a huge difference to the ability of an organization to focus its mind on the things it really needs to focus on.
James, you've got your hand up. Have you got another question?
No. It was really just the fact that David was hanging there saying, I wonder what my answer to it is. And it's useful to know that that is the case, because it sometimes feels as though, the trusts and foundations don't have the capacity to have a telephone call with you, let alone a meeting, or to visit the great work being done on site. And I have to say that people who know us, it's wonderful when you get somebody on site to smell and hear and sense what we do, because then they suddenly say, now I get it. Whereas in an application, when it's just black and white words, it's very difficult to get that full sense. But it sometimes feels as though, where you've got the opportunity for the relationship, which goes back to the idea of people refunding organizations that they have a relationship, that essential part of the empathy and the human connection is what we're all about anyway. And therefore, sometimes when you put an application in that you think is absolutely aligned, and then sometimes you never even hear an acknowledgement, or that you didn't get it, the fact that people just don't respond, when I understand on average it takes up to 20 hours to write an application, you know, that's everybody competing, putting 20 hours per application. And as we've said before, the pot is getting smaller, the demand is getting bigger. And as a result, I think you'll find an awful lot of organizations who could collaborate are suddenly going to become very aggressively competitive, which then kicks a whole lot of other dilemma into the space. But it's just useful to know that I feel like I'm right, that you've confirmed that there are computer systems assessing the first tranche of applications, but then sometimes the potential reward is so big that you can't not put that online application in.
Yeah.
So lottery or youth.
It really is either or. I mean, you are both and because well, time and time again, the practice you've described of being rejected without even hearing you've been rejected is just so depressing, and it does highlight why some foundations are able to demonstrate a hell of a lot better behavior than that. but an awful lot of them, I'm afraid, do not, and do treat it as a transaction which in their eyes has no cost, whereas of course it has enormous cost for the fundraising community. And finding ways of improving that practice is very, very crucial. And there is some interesting work going on. And I just draw attention to the point that I think Bill made early on, that there have been and are continuing to be increasing use of collaborations between foundations. And one of the ways we certainly managed to reduce costs in the 90s and early noughties was by getting foundations to work together so that not all of them were requiring you to apply individually for the same thing. And so one foundation would take a lead, would either act as an intermediary for the others, rather like a community foundation does, or would at least ensure that the assessment process was limited so that you weren't having to go through the same number of hoops every single time. And the same applies to reporting. There's absolutely no reason why multiple funders who are funding the same organization should demand different reporting systems from you. It's perfectly possible for collaborations to get rid of that sort of behavior. And there are indications that some are doing it. I just wish that more of them were, and your experience, therefore, was to find more of them doing it.
I just quickly come in with just a quick thing, I think, because I think the debate is front door, back door. So front door will be maybe online and algorithms, maybe. But then all of the experience I see and everything I see is the majority of money and the majority of the larger funding does not go through front door processes. It's backdoor, it's referrals, it's we find you. It's a much more complicated and perhaps a more human process. And I would include the national lottery within that as well. And I can't say I'm seeing a huge shift in the funders I'm working with as to this balance between front door, back door. In fact, if anything, and I'm talking on a global level now, I'm seeing backdoor decision-making becoming more significant, with more funders not being open to unsolicited applications and more of them using referral channels. So yeah, that's what concerns me more, is how you get into the backdoor conversations and the algorithms in the front door.
And especially, Bill, when we've discussed this before, when it's much harder to see people face to face nowadays, it's less popular. Somebody popped a comment in the chat regarding how National Fiona, thank you, how the National Lottery at one point said they'd be happy to have initial conversations, but obviously got flooded with people requesting initial conversations and then have withdrawn that. So when we're quite limited in our post-COVID world with getting together with people and getting these face-to-face meetings, when people just want you to send them something electronically, I think it's making it harder maybe for those, you know, new backdoor.
Yeah, definitely. But I think your funders are your biggest asset. So the backdoor conversations are largely happening between funders. And you know, the point that David and I made about increasing collaborations is that funder that you have probably is your best way of getting into that new funder or the other funder. So it's engaging them as your advocates and your introducers is absolutely vitally important. I mean, we've had a few of our clients get money from Mackenzie Scott, who was Jeff Bezos' ex-partner, who gave out $14 billion over the first 2 years of her philanthropy. 14, made twice bigger than Gates. And virtually all of her grants were made through referral. The organizations couldn't find her. And I think that, and she's a kind of beacon of trust-based philanthropy. And I think that approach now is becoming much more significant. Gosh, we've hit coming up to a couple of minutes to go.
Yeah. There's one quick question in the chat that I'd like to just touch on, but I think it opens a whole can of fish that we
I don't mind stopping on for another 10-15 minutes. I don't know, David, but I'm not got the meeting. So
okay. Thank you, Bill. Just really quickly, Fiona's asked in the chat, what about the use of AI? This is a topic that is, you know, of interest for everybody. And interesting, we have got a topic coming up, a session coming up in the new year that I think everyone will find very interesting for this fundraising group. But what impact is being seen at the moment, and do we assume that it will make it easier for people to apply for grants, therefore lots of people can do it, or do you think it's something that's going to have a controlling effect on the way in which we apply for grants?
David, I'll let you do that first.
Gosh me. Well, I mean, I had a discussion a little while ago with a funder who was very suspicious of an application they had received from an unnamed charity with some reputation, and they were pretty convinced the application had been generated by AI. So it works both ways. I think funders are also concerned that they may not be hearing it straight from the horse's mouth in an AI-dominated world. But I was going back to something you were saying, I think, Sophie, earlier, or I feel like I can't remember which of you it was. Funders talk to other funders. They also talk within the sectors they have an interest in, whether it be a community foundation talking in a place that they serve, or a mental health focused foundation talking with agencies that are active in mental health activity, or a global funder talking with global NGOs. And to ensure for a fundraiser to be operating outside the communications world that its organization is using to be present in those networks and in those discussions is pretty desperate. I mean, the fundraiser needs to be alert to and engaged with, it seems to me, the discussions that the funders are having within their specialist networks. So if you're a global funder, for example, and the organizations are not participating actively in reading and work, say, on Alliance, the journal on global funding, global philanthropy. I mean, there you will see constantly funders and funded in communication with each other. And so if you're worried that there's too much use of funders receiving applications which have not been publicly advertised, but they're dealing with people they know, it's partly because they're dealing with people they know through those network discussions. So it's really important, if you've got the opportunity, you've got resources, you've got the capacity, for the charities that are active in any particular sector to be engaging in the discussions that those funders are present at, because that's where the funders learn.
Yeah, I'm going to come back on AI because we're next week we're starting a series of 4 workshops on writing for impact, and the first workshop is about brevity. So how do you condense your words into a word count? We do a little exercise in the game where we ask participants, we introduce a skill, we ask participants to put it in practice, carve out, cut to pieces of a text. We run it against ChatGPT, and the AI wins every time. So I'm really kind of intrigued about why on earth we're running the workshop, because we just say to people, take your ill-gotten gains and rubbish, put it into chat, and it will tidy it up for you. And also doing a lot of work globally where English is probably someone's 4th language. It can be an incredible liberator. And I do worry a lot sometimes that a lot of funding decisions are made on the quality of your use of English rather than whether you can run a work stall. And so in some ways, I think AI is lowering boundaries for people for whom English is not their primary language. So I think it does have some major advantages. I'm worried about whether we will be running a writing for impact cluster in 2 years' time. Also, the other thing I found really useful is it's an amazing gatherer of information about your organization. It seems to be able to find more things out about your organization than you could ever do by having conversations. So I think it's an amazing resource. But the funders I work with, most of them would not use it. Most of them are really concerned about authenticity. But they're not using the front door to make the decisions, if I'm being honest. It's referral, recommendations, knowledge, it's other things that are guiding whether they fund these people.
Thanks, Bill. Really interesting. I'm really aware that we've just gone over 11 o'clock, but Emma's had her hand out. So this is going to be the last question comment, and then I think we'll wrap things up, if that's okay with everyone.
Emma.
Yeah, it's sort of a question and a reflection. Firstly, it was really interesting to see your data for the last 4 years. I'm going back to your data presentation at the beginning, and just seeing the incredible kind of volatility over the last 4 years. Do you think this period has been the most volatile that you've seen? I think you said you've been tracking this data for the last 20 or so years. has this last 4-year period been the most volatile that you've seen, or have there been other peaks and troughs?
Well, obviously there was 2008.
Yeah. Did that have an impact on grant giving? And
yes, it did. Yeah, it really did. It had an impact. And I mean, in many ways, the turbulence that took place in 2008 has a lot of similarities. And we reckon it took 3 years after 2008 for things to kind of get back to a growth curve. And my gut feeling is, and I actually think we're in a real double dip situation here. So we've been through the pandemic, and we're also going through a cost of living and a very uncertain economic picture. I fear that normality might take another 3 years before we'll be able to see anything. I mean, if I'm honest, if I was sitting there as a finance director of a foundation looking at your income returns and the turbulence has gone through it, I would be very conservative. And I, you know, for me, the supply of money is the biggest determinant of our opportunities. I'm concerned about the wealth in our economy. I think we're not a wealthy economy. I mean, every year we get further away from empire, we become a poorer economy. And I think, yeah, I don't see the disposable wealth around that we would have seen 10, 15 years ago.
I think
so. Yeah, I'm a bit pessimistic at the moment.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. And, you know, I think there's a huge other conversation we can have about the sources and distribution of wealth that's probably not justifiable in this session. But I think my reflection kind of touches on that a little bit, which is, I mean, and maybe it's a reflection on the kind of clients that I've been working for, but it's very difficult to be a new organization or a new project breaking into the sort of the grant sector. I'm finding that a lot of them are having to start with community events, community giving, you know, those sorts of sort of individual face-to-face type kind of fundraising before they can get to a situation where they can apply for grants, because they're just not, some of them, you know, and I'm just thinking of a couple of projects that I'm working with, one in the heritage sector, one in mental health, where they're finding themselves very much up against the competition of the very, very, very topical of post-COVID response, cost of living response, and some of the sort of more the other kind of topical things around Black Lives Matter and climate change. And if they're not directly relevant, they're just not, you know, they're not even getting a foot in the door, which makes it very difficult to be a startup at the moment.
Yeah, I could echo that. I mean, again, in my humble opinion, the biggest single reason why you're going to get more from a foundation or get into a foundation for the first time is if they've got more money.
Yeah. So
you've either got the option that they have a natural carousel of throwing people off the bus and taking new people on, and that's their natural behaviour. So there is empty seats for a ride, great. Or the other factor is, yeah, they'll take on new people because they got new money. And I think at the moment, because of all the uncertainty and the income, I don't think there's going to be a lot of new money around in trust for a while. Having said that, you get 4 or 5 that completely break the trend because of their individual circumstances. And if you happen to be a friend of them, you're all right. If you're not, you're not.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for that question, Emma. Massive thank you, Bill and David, for joining us this morning. So much information. What I was just going to say to everybody is, with the survey that's going to come out to you, I think probably tomorrow, please feel free to add any comments that you would like me to pass on to Bill and David for their research, anything that you found out, and I will make sure that everything does go on, you know, go to them, because I appreciate sometimes it's a little bit hard to be typing in the chat box and listen at the same time. So yeah, please do have a look at that survey and let us know any thoughts that we can pass on to Bill and David. So thanks ever so much, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you all again next time. Just one thing on the notes. We will share the slides, and obviously you'll get the recording, but the actual meat of this fish tank research, I want to be able to complete it so I get as near to the 100 as possible. So that might take me next week or the week after. So I'd rather get that report out
on a more valid like-for-like comparison than what I've got at the moment. Because I'm just saying, all of the misery I might have shared might be completely changed by the remaining funders.
You're sending off, 70 odd trust fundraisers who are now all doom and gloom. Bill, only joking.
I know. If I'm going to send you out gloomy, I'd like to do it on a valid data.
Yeah, we're all going to be looking for new jobs next week. No,
Yeah.
Thank you ever so much. Thanks everyone for joining us, and see you again soon.